Welcome everyone to Data Manager Training session number 5. I am going to, first, welcome to our panelists today from the STS. Today we have Leanne Jones, Emily Conrad, Carol Crone, Paul Meehan, Bonnie Yahtzee, and Melinda Offer will be delivering our education today. So I will go ahead and turn everything over to Melinda.
I'm going to just share. All right, hold on just a second. Can you guys see that now?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. This is session 5, as Nancy said. A lot of information in this session. I'm going to try to get it all done in the hour and a half that we have. And hopefully you'll leave this session learning something new. All right, let's get started. So what are our objectives today? We're going to look at the National Report Analysis Overview. There's a lot of important information in that report. We're going to review the process and outcome measures, formerly called the NQF document measures. And then we're going to talk about how star ratings are derived and a little bit about the star ratings. Okay, so again, I think it's important that the first thing to know is getting to the national report, because I get a lot of questions about that. So the national report overview is in the IQVIA library. Okay, so you have to access the database, get into the IQVIA library, and when you get into the library, you can see that you have the national report here posted, and you can see it was just updated in December of this past year. So what does the national report contain? Well, it talks about the structure and the content of the quarterly reports. It discusses the risk-adjusted and quality ratings methodology. It gives you instructions on how you can utilize STS risk adjustment locally. It talks about quality ratings and an interpretation of the process and outcome measures. So it's got a great deal of information in it. I think the important thing, first of all, is to educate yourself when you're starting to go through this. And I know I've said that I'm preaching to the choir, but I can say it every time. There's a lot of useful information. So you can see these how-to videos on the STS website. This is under the For Data Manager tab. If you just scroll down, and it's got the risk-adjusted dashboard report. It's a sort of a nice video that tells you what it is and how to read it and how to navigate through it. So we're going to talk about the risk-adjusted dashboard first, because in the old days, we actually got a PDF. So our reports came out as a PDF. It was emailed to us, and you could print those off and carry them around. And you know, they were nice and handy, and we all liked them. But then, you know, that was a lot of paper, a lot of printing, a lot of this and that. So what happened is the old report got replaced by this electronic report. And so your risk-adjusted report is basically your old harvest report that you used to get in the email and print it off and run it to the surgeon. So it's in IQVIA under the operational reports, and then you'll see your risk-adjusted dashboard report. Okay. So when you first open up your risk-adjusted dashboard report, this is the main screen that you enter into. And you can see there's quality ratings, rating trends. There's all kinds of different sections that you can go into. We're going to talk about these sections, and then we're going to talk about the things that are relevant in the sections. So when we start with the quality rating detail in the rating trends section. So in the quality rating section, that's your participant star rating. So that's where you find your star ratings. In the rating detail, it's more like a drill down, and you can kind of look at things that may have fallen out, and then you have trends over time. So just to give you an example, so when you open the quality ratings, you can see that that's where your star rating is, okay? And then when you open the quality rating details, you can see things that, you may have fallen out of. You can actually interact with this dashboard and click into these blue areas, like for example, cerebrovascular accident only, there's 6. So you could click into that and it would pop up and say, well, these are the cases that happened in. So you can do a little drill down and find out where you might have had some failures. And then your rating trends over time, you can kind of just say, well, okay, this is what I did this year and the year before, and you can kind of get an idea of how things are going and where your star ratings are going. So that's that section. Now we're going to dive deeper into that section to talk about what each of these things mean. So when you look at this report, the first column over here says domain. Okay, so, and you can see that you've got an overall absence of mortality, absence of morbidity, use of IMA, and medications. And this is a CABG report, of course. So domain 1 is absence of operative mortality. Domain 2 is absence of major morbidity. Domain 3 is the use of the internal mammary artery. And domain 4 is the use of all evidence-based perioperative medications. So for 2 of the domains, mortality and IMA, those 2, the study endpoint corresponds to a single measure. So basically, did the patient die, yes or no, or was the IMA used, yes or no? So it's a single measure endpoint. The other domains, morbidity and medications, the study endpoint is defined via a combination of multiple things. And we'll talk more about that as we go through each one of these domains, which is what we're going to start with next. So when you look at the first domain, and as you can see, I'm taking stuff from the analysis overview where it talks about the domains, and I'm also have the STS NQF endorsed measures. So we're going to be looking at these kind of simultaneously because these 2 documents, in my mind, go hand in hand. And I use them both the same amount of time because they both have great information. So when you look at the absence of operative mortality, so what does that mean? So operative mortality, all deaths, regardless of cause, occurring during the hospitalization in which the operation was performed, even if that's after 30 days, including patients transferred to another acute care facility. So that's the first definition of operative mortality. The second is all deaths, regardless of cause, occurring after discharge from the hospital, but before the end of the 30th post-op day. And then the third component is all patients discharged to hospice. And as you can see on the NQF document, which we now call the process and outcome document, we just need to kind of get that updated on the website. But, and I know Nancy's working on that. So you can see that you've got one for operative mortality for CABG, you've got one for AVR. When you scroll through here, you've also got mitral valve repair, So each one of these has like a numerator, a denominator, the patients that are included, and then the exclusions. Let me go back up here to this first part, exclusions. I want you to notice for operative mortality, every one of these slides, in this last column, exclusions, there are none. Okay? Because I get a lot of questions about, well, my patient was emergent salvage. Is he going to be excluded from operative mortality? No, there are no exclusions for operative mortality. So I do want to point that out. This is an important document to be familiar with because it will provide you with the exclusions for the particular measure. The second domain is the absence of major morbidity. And the really important thing here is this is just for isolated CAB patients, okay? So major morbidity is defined as having at least one of the following adverse outcomes. So reoperations for any cardiac reason. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. Renal failure, deep sternal wound infection, prolonged ventilation or intubation, and a cerebral vascular accident or a stroke. Now, the important thing to remember is that the endpoint here is composed of all 5 of these, okay? So this is an any or none measure. So if you have renal failure, you're included. If you have a deep sternal wound, you're included. It's any or none measure. So you can have any of these and still be in that measure. So when we look at risk-adjusted surgical re-exploration, so this is part of domain 2. Again, this is only for isolated CAB patients. Really important to remember that. The reoperations for any cardiac reason. Re-op for bleeding or tamponade. Re-op for valve dysfunction. Unplanned coronary artery intervention. Aortic reintervention. Re-op for other cardiac reasons. Those are the re-ops that are included. Note that re-op non-cardiac is not included in this measure. And you can see the exclusion here. Cases are removed from the denominator if the patient expired in the OR. And this is, again, all patients undergoing isolated CAB procedures. So it's very clear in this endorsed measure what patients are included, what surgeries, what re-ops are included in this measure, and what are the exclusions for this measure. When we look at post-op renal failure, again, this is an isolated CAB patient only measure. You can see what the exclusions are when you look here at version 4.2. The exclusions, the pre-op last creatinine equal or greater to 4. So if your patient enters the OR with the last creatinine of equal or greater to 4, that patient will be excluded from this measure. If you code pre-op dialysis yes, then the patient is excluded from this measure, or if the patient expired in the OR. Lately, I've been getting a lot of questions about patients that have creatinines above 4 pre-op, and then they end up on dialysis post-op. But we have instructions in the training manual. So if your patient has a creatinine greater to or equal to 4 on the last creatinine, or your patient's on pre-op dialysis, then you don't code renal failure as a post-op complication because it was a pre-existing issue, and those people are excluded from this measure. So I did want to point that out because I've had a rash of questions about that lately. As we move through the next absence of morbidity, inclusion is risk-adjusted deep sternal wound infection rate. Now, again, this is just for isolated CAB patients. We're looking for deep sternal wound, organ space, or mediastinitis in this particular measure. It's an infection within 30 days of the procedure or during the initial hospitalization. So if the patient goes home and within 30 days they have a deep sternal wound, they're included. If the patient is in the hospital 60 days and gets a deep sternal wound infection, they're included. I like to point this out that for infection, the date of the event occurs within 30 days after the index procedure, where day 1 equals the procedure date. That's a little different than how we count some other things, but this is how the infection people count it. So that's what we do. We follow their rules. Again, you can see that there's not a lot of exclusions here. Basically, if you expire in the OR, you'll be excluded from this particular measure. The next domain for absence of major morbidity are risk-adjusted postoperative prolonged vent. Again, this is just for isolated CAB patients. Very few exclusions. If you die in the OR, you are excluded from this metric. It does not matter if you're intubated prior to surgery or not. That is not an exclusion. The only exclusion is expired in the OR. Prolonged vent is defined as ventilation exceeding 24 hours in the postoperative period. This time includes hours from OR exit till extubation, plus any of the additional hours that may occur if the patient is re-intubated. And it is greater than 24, so 24.2, that's prolonged vent. 24.4, that's prolonged vent. Okay. The next domain in here has to do with risk-adjusted stroke, cerebral vascular accident. Again, this is isolated CAB patients only. The only exclusion is if they expire in the OR, then they're excluded from this measure. Okay, so that was domain 2. And as you can see, not only do we have the information and the analysis overview for the domains, but we also have very detailed information in the process and outcome document. The process and outcome document is located in the on the STS website under basically when you get to your training manual, just scroll down for additional resources and you'll find it there. Now we're going to talk about domain 3, use of the internal mammary artery. So it's the proportion of first-time CABG patients who receive at least one IMA graft. So this is an isolated CAB only measure. So if the surgeon is performing a CABG plus an AVR, it doesn't matter if he uses the IMA or not. It's not in the measure. That patient is excluded from the measure. So if you're feeling nervous, they didn't use an IMA in this CABG AVR, don't feel nervous. Just if you don't have a reasonable explanation, it's not one of the reasons here for not using the IMA, such as subclavian stenosis, previous cardiac or thoracic surgery, previous mediastinal radiation, emergent or salvage procedure, or no bypassable disease, or other acceptable, we'll talk about that in a minute, then just go ahead and code the non-acceptable, because again, this is only for isolated CAB patients. Now, when you look at these reasons, these are the reasons. If you code no to IMA, then you have to answer why you didn't use it. What was your reason? So subclavian stenosis, just want to mention a few things here. That needs to be documented pre-op. So if you're, unsure whether the surgeon's saying the patient has subclavian stenosis, you're a little unsure because you don't see it pre-op anywhere, then send me a question, because we want to make sure that that patient actually had subclavian stenosis, and that's the reason it wasn't used. Previous cardiac or thoracic surgery, there's a lot of information in the training manual about that, especially thoracic surgery. The IMA that you're using needs to be ipsilateral to the side the thoracic surgery was on. Previous mediastinal radiation, hostile chest, basically. Emergent or salvage procedure. I get lots of questions about this one, and I think the main reason is because it's easy if you're going in and it's an emergent or salvage procedure, like you're going in there and it's an emergency. But if you get in there and oops, something happens or the patient crashes, and so they didn't enter the OR as an emergent salvage procedure, but then after they get in there, things go south, and the doctor says, okay, I can't take the IMA. This is an emergent situation. I've got to get this patient on bypass and get going here. Then you still can use that reason, because that was the reason that surgeon couldn't use the IMA in that particular situation. So if you have questions about that, let me know. I get quite a few questions about that. No bypassable LAD disease. Remember, this does have some other qualifiers in the training manual. You can't have any left main disease. And when we're talking about LAD disease, we're talking about LAD proper. So your main LAD, not your diags. The other acceptable STS provided occlusion. So I'm going to just say this. If you are coding this, then you need to be sending me a question, because these particular cases, if we're using this reason for no IMA, need to be adjudicated by surgeon leadership, or their answer already needs to be in the training manual, because we have a whole slew of things that have been already adjudicated in the training manual. This is definitely an audit field. So I did want to mention that. Okay, domain 4, use of all evidence-based perioperative medications. This is for isolated CAB patients only. So the required perioperative medications are pre-op beta blocker therapy, discharge antiplatelet medication, which includes an aspirin, an ADP inhibitor, and or other antiplatelet, a discharge beta blocker, and a discharge antilipid, which basically is a discharge statin. We'll talk about that. This is this endpoint basically here is, did the patient receive all the medications among the 4? So it's yes or no. It's a combined measure. So if your patient received all of these, that's a yes. If they fell out of one, that's a no. We're going to break this down. We're going to go through these medications. So pre-op beta blocker, again, It's just for isolated calves. I want you to note the exclusions. Pre-op beta blocker equals contraindicated, so you've got a documentation that it's contraindicated. Or the status going into the operating room is emergent salvage. So that's your status, sequence 1975. Now, if you have status emergent salvage and you don't have a contraindicated beta blocker, you just code no, because cases that have the status marked as emergent or emergent salvage are going to be excluded from this metric. Okay. The next measure, medication, is antiplatelet medication at discharge. This is only isolated calves. We do have some exclusions that are important to know. Expired in the OR or an in-hospital mortality. Left AMA, discharged to hospice. Your medications will blank out. Discharge aspirin or discharge ADP or other discharge antiplatelet was contraindicated. We recently added some language in the training manual because we discovered that if you marked contraindicated for either one of these, your patient was removed from the metric. So to avoid patient removal from the denominator, please code no to the other antiplatelet medications instead of contraindicated if the patient is sent home on one of the three antiplatelets. So they only have to go home on one. So for example, your patient is ordered aspirin on discharge and the provider documents that the ADP is contraindicated in the medical record. Code yes to aspirin and no to ADP. Because if you don't, if you code contraindicated ADP, the patient will fall out of, be excluded from the measure. If none of the three antiplatelet medications are ordered on discharge, then there must be a documented contraindication as above in order to code the medication as contraindicated. So basically, the bottom line here is your isolated cab needs to go home on an aspirin or an ADP or some other kind of antiplatelet, or have a contraindication documented to one of those. Beta blocker at discharge. This is isolated cabs only. Pretty much the same exclusions as your antiplatelet. You expired in the OR, you died in the hospital, you left AMA, you went to hospice, or the beta blocker was contraindicated, discharge beta blocker. Anti-lipid, it's the last medication in this domain. It's for isolated cab patients only. Beginning in version 2.8, only statins are used in this measure. So it really is a discharge statin, okay? So if you have an isolated cab patient, they need to go home on a statin, or they need to have documentation as to a contraindication for the statin. The other exclusions for this metric are expired in the OR, in hospital mortality, left AMA, or went to hospice. Okay. All right. So we've gone through all the domains, and now we're gonna start getting into star ratings a little bit, and we're gonna look at those reports and talk about what those things mean. So, star ratings are derived by testing whether the participants composite or domain score is significantly different from the overall STS average. So, for example, if for each of the 4 composite score domains, the participant's estimated score is lower than the overall STS average, but the difference between the participant and the STS is not statistically significant, the rating is going to be 2 stars. If, however, the overall composite, the point estimate is lower than the STS average, and this difference is significantly different, the overall participant star rating is 1. So I think the main takeaway here for me is it's really not all about you, okay? Your star rating has to do a lot with what everybody else is doing, okay? Because you can see as we talk through this that if you're not statistically different from the STS, you're probably going to get 2 stars, okay? So as we go through this, when we pull up column 2 on the rating here, this is where you're assigned your stars. And of course, 3 stars is means your performance is significantly higher than the STS mean. Okay. And so this is the STS mean right here, the score. Okay, so right here. Oops, sorry, I think I accidentally went ahead. 2 stars, your participant performance is not statistically different from the STS mean. So you're about the same average. And 1 star, your performance is lower than the STS mean. Okay, so when we talk mean is the average of all the scores across all the participants in the analysis. So let's continue looking at this rating here. So when we look at the participant, I've circled it in red here. You have a score and you have this thing called 95% CI. Well, what does that mean? So the score is pretty intuitive. That's your estimated performance score, okay, within each domain. Now, the CI, let's talk about that. What does that mean? So the Bayesian credible interval shows the range in which the participant's true score is likely to lie. So 95% credible intervals are used for analyzed procedures. So this is your 95% credible interval. Now, this is a statistical thing, and I'm not a statistician, but I'm going to tell you what I know about it. So the Bayesian credible interval has an intuitive probability interpretation. For example, based on the observed data, we can state that it is 95% likely that the true proportion falls within the upper and lower limits of the 95% credible interval. So here's your score, 98, and here's your credible interval. So these are where your scores are likely to fall, most of your scores. If the lower limit of the 95% credible interval is greater than the STS average, then it is at least 97.5% likely that the participant's true performance exceeds the STS average. Okay, that's a mouthful, I know. I've got an example on the next slide. If the upper limit of your 95% credible interval is less than the STS value, then it is at least 97.5% likely that the participant's true performance is less than the STS value. So let's look and see what that means. Okay, so here's an example of that. So here's your score up here at the top, the first one, 97.55. You look at your confidence interval and your credible interval, and it's 96.7 to 98.2. Now you look at the STS score, 96.68. So your score is higher than the STS score. Okay, so that's good. And the STS score lower than the site's lowest value in the credible interval. So see, your lowest value in your credible interval is 96.7. Their score, STS, is 96.6. You're going to get 3 stars for that. Okay. On the other hand, the second example right underneath this, your score is 97.7. The STS score is 97.42. So you're better. However, when you look at your credible intervals, the STS score is in your credible interval. So that means you're going to get 2 stars. It's just kind of a little way to look at it and understand it a little bit better. But the main thing here is it's really not all about what you're doing. If the whole STS mean is shifting higher and you're not moving, then that's going to affect your star rating. So it's really about what everybody else is doing in relation to what you're doing. Because sometimes we get questions about, well, I dropped a star or I went down a star. What can I do to make it better? Well, it may really not be what you're doing. It may be doing what everybody else is doing out there. So I wanted you to understand that star ratings are based on more than just what you're doing. Okay, so we talked about the participants, so I feel like you kind of understand that now. Now let's talk about the STS side of it. So there's the STS score. This is the average of all the scores across all the participants in this analysis. Okay, it's kind of a great benchmark for you. When I look at this, I'm like, your overall is 98, the STS score is 96. Okay, I'm doing good. My absence of mortality is 98.3. The STS is only 97. So I'm doing good, So I'm comparing my score against the STS score. And if I'm above what their score is, then I'm feeling pretty good about what I'm doing. You can see that the medication is 2 down here, and you're a little bit below the average score of the STS. So maybe a little work there. It's just a quick way to benchmark what you're doing versus what everybody else is doing in the analysis. Column 5 is the distribution of the scores. So we've got some labels here. The min, max denote the estimated lowest and highest participant scores among all the participants. So when you look at this overall first line here, so the minimum score for everybody was 90.3 and the max was 99.18. So you can see the ranges of everybody in the analysis. We also have the 10th, 50th, and 90th percentile. So this is distribution among all the other participants. So the 10th percentile, the value under which 10% of the individuals lie. So when we look at the first line here, the 10th percentile is 95.49. So 10% of the people in this group lie under that score. If you look at the 50th percentile, 97.17, 50% are under that number. And if you look at the 90th percentile, 98.2, that score for the 90th, then you've got 90 percentile people being below that score. And then you look at your score, no wonder you got 3 stars, because you're actually higher than the 90th percentile, because it's 98.22 and you're 98.23. So just a quick way to know how to read that and understand what you're looking at here. So some of this is going to be, we're going to kind of go through this. There's going to be a lot of repetition, so I'm not going to go through all of this stuff again, but I'm showing you where everything is in this report. So we've talked all about quality ratings, quality rating details, and rating trends. Now we want to look at the process and outcome measures. For cabbages, we're going to start there. We've already mentioned what the process measures are. It's pre-op beta blocker, use of IMA, discharge antiplatelet, discharge beta blocker, and discharge antolipid. The report is laid out very similar to what we just looked at. You can see that you have the participant here. That's you. You've got your eligible procedures. So those are the number of cases performed by the participant that meets eligibility. This is your score, 95.14. So that's the percentage of eligible isolated cases for which the patient received the specified therapy. You've got your credible interval. You've got the percentile, and the participant percentile indicates the percentage of STS participants who applied the therapy in their retrospective populations less frequently than or as frequently as you did. So you can kind of get an idea. You're at 95, your score, there's about 20% people that are just where you're at or below where you're at. And then if we look at the STS side, pretty much the same thing we just talked about. You've got the overall STS score, the mean against anybody that's in this analysis. You've got the minimum and maximum scores for people. You also have the 10th, 50th, and 90th scores. So a lot of the same things we just talked about as we go through this. Outcome measures for cabbage, mortality and morbidity. We pretty much already talked about that, but we're going to talk about odds ratio for a little bit. So when you look at your outcome measures, this report looks a little bit different. And so instead of getting a score, a percentage score, you get an odds ratio. So, and that is the main summary statistics that is provided. And this is definitely a statistical hierarchical logistic regression analysis number. Okay, this is not something that I can calculate or you can calculate at your site. This is a very highly detailed and calculated statistical number. So, but let's talk about OR just for a little bit. And the main takeaway, an OR greater than 1 implies that the participant increases a patient's risk of experiencing the adverse outcome compared to the average. Because you'll look here, the STS is always 1. All of those odds ratios are always 1. So if you are less than 1, that means you're doing better than the STS average. If you are greater than 1, that means you need a little work because you're not doing as well as the STS average. Again, this layout is very similar. We have the odds ratio. I'm not going to go through all of the different sections, but I wanted to provide this for reference since we've already kind of talked about what these things mean. Again, the same thing with the STS. So you've got their estimated OR, they're always 1. They're always going to be 1. And then the min max column and the 10th, 50th, and 90th percentile column. As we get into the all cardiac surgery process measures, so this is the one thing so far we haven't talked about that's also in the NQF document, or the process and outcome measure document: antibiotic selection, timing, and discontinuation. So we're going to go through that now. That's included in the all cardiac surgery process measures. And you can see it's very similar. You've got eligible procedures, you got a score, you got a credible interval, you got your percentile, and then you've got the STS score, min, max, 10th, 50th, and 90th percentile there. Very similar looking to the other reports. These are the NQF, or process outcome measures, with the description, numerator, denominator, and exclusions for your 3 antibiotic measures. Notice that this is for all cardiac surgeries. Cardiac procedure is determined as a procedure for which at least one of the following is not marked no. So if you've got a CAB, a valve, a VAD, other cardiac, ECMO, aorta, AFib, that's going to all fall into this all cardiac surgeries. There are a few exclusions listed here on the NQF document. However, the training manual includes the comprehensive list of exclusions for antibiotic selection, timing, and discontinuation. Do note that for expired in the OR is an exclusion for antibiotic discontinuation, but they still are expected to have the appropriate antibiotic selection and timing, although if they die in the OR, they're excluded from the duration for discontinuation. Okay, mortality and outcome measures. This just shows, like, I think this is kind of an interesting little graph. Basically, you have all of your mortality kind of grouped in one place. The layout and the verbiage is very similar to what we already discussed, so I'm not going to go through all that again. I just wanted to show you what was in this section for the outcome and mortality measure section of your report. The risk-adjusted and regional outcomes reports. This is kind of interesting. We have a couple new language stuff going in here, so we'll talk about that. So you've got your site. Well, that's of course you. And then we have a like group. So what's a like group? So the like group is a comparison group of STS participants that are most similar to you with respect to your case volume and the presence or absence of a surgical residency program. And then you also have your region. So for most participants, the region is the state or province in which they are located. And then you have your STS score, and this is your Ming STS score. We've already discussed the average of all the scores in the analysis. So you can kind of get an idea of how you're doing versus your like group versus your region group versus the STS. Now, the like group, just to say a few more things about the like group. So a participant is considered to have a surgical residency program if at least one of the hospitals for which data was submitted has a known residency program. Okay. Participants located outside of the United States are not considered to have a residency program, so they would not get a like group. They would not be into the like group for residencies for sure. Like groups are determined following each harvest. So each harvest, you get a like group, and you get 2 of them. You got your cabbage like group and your valve like group. And this is a chart in the analysis overview that basically gives you an idea of what group you're going to be in based on your volume and whether you have a surgical residency or not, for both the cabbage and the valve. That information is in the analysis overview. In addition, in the analysis overview, you have the regions. So if you live in North Carolina, you can easily find out that you're in the South Atlantic region group. If you live in Alaska, you're in the Pacific region group. So it shows you what other states are included in your region. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about risk-adjusted summary statistics now. And the reason we're going to talk about this is because we have reports where we provide, not only do we provide the odds ratio, which we've already talked about, that highly technical statistical summary number that's obtained through hierarchical regression. But now we're going to talk about the OE, which is the observed over the expected. It just kind of lets you know what that is and tell you why we use both of them. So when you look at your risk adjustment for mortality, you can see that you have an odds ratio, okay? But you also have an OE, which is an observed versus expected ratio. And you have a risk-adjusted rate too, and you have an STS event rate. So what's the difference between an OE and an OR? Well, there are differences, slight differences. The OE ratio, a lot of surgeons are familiar with that. It's kind of a simple way to, and you can actually calculate that if you've got multipliers and stuff. So we want to provide that in addition to the odds ratio. The odds ratio, I think, probably is definitely not able to be easily calculated or calculated at your site, but we're giving you both of them, so you have both of them. Again, when you look at the STS, it's always 1. The OR, the odds ratio is 1. The OE is 1. Okay. One's pretty much, I consider, average. So very simplified version here is much like the odds ratio. So if your OE is greater than 1, then you are doing worse than expected. If your OE is less than 1, then you're doing better than expected. And if your OE is 1, you're doing as expected. Okay. So the main reason we provide 2 is because some surgeons like the odds ratio, some like the OE. So we provide both. But the interpretations as far as greater than 1, less than 1, and equals to 1 are pretty much the same for the OE and the odds and the OR. Risk-adjusted rate, and let's go back to this slide real quick. So you have a risk-adjusted rate here. This is your risk-adjusted rate, which is 2.95. And then you come on the way over here, and the STS is 1.61. Well, that's quite a bit higher than the average. So what does that mean? So when the risk-adjusted rate for a particular adverse outcome is greater than the STS average, then the participant had more of those outcomes than expected. So if you're worse than the STS average, you're higher than the STS average, that means you got a little work to work on, because you're not doing as expected. You're doing worse than expected. If your risk-adjusted rate is less than the STS event rate, then you're doing good, doing better than expected. And if you're exactly the same, then you're doing as expected. Okay, benchmark reports. We'll just talk briefly about what's in the benchmark report section. So participants' non-risk adjusted analyzed data, got a like participant group comparison, and you've got some overall STS for these types of procedures that are in the benchmark reports. When you get into the benchmark reports, you can easily interact with this. You've got a next button to move on to the next complication, but you can kind of see you've got your site, your like group, the STS site. So you're getting comparisons and benchmarking for different types of complications, lengths of stay, event hours, and things of that nature. Pretty detailed reports there. Okay. I want to just mention the operational reports, the longitudinal outcome dashboard, which is risk adjusted. So the longitudinal outcomes dashboard provides users with the ability to display their on-site OE and risk-adjusted rates for all operative major morbidity and mortality outcomes longitudinally over time. So it's usually like a 3-year harvest period, and you can drill down, you could look at things, you can see how you're doing over time. I think one thing that we do get questions about sometimes is people want to know why there are slight differences in the risk-adjusted dashboard report and the longitudinal dashboard report. And I had to ask the research center about this, but basically the risk-adjusted dashboard report uses the fixed historical estimates of the expected event probabilities based on the adult cardiac surgical database risk-adjusted models that were published in 2018. In comparison, the longitudinal dashboard updates these expected probabilities every harvest. So you might notice just very slight differences between those two. I think in the future there's some, they're working on ways to migrate that so that we don't have those deviations. But for now, just be aware if you see some slight differences between these two reports, that's the reason why. When you open up the longitudinal dashboard reporting, this is just an example of what it looks like. You can see how you can go to different sections, mortality versus stroke versus renal failure versus deep sternal wound. It's very interactive and has some really nice graphics that I like. If you need more information on how to navigate that dashboard, the longitudinal dashboard, if you go into the IQVIA library, they have a nice resource in there for you. And I didn't want to finish this presentation without mentioning this because I get questions about this. In the IQVIA library, they also have the COVID positive patients included in risk adjusted analysis. So that'll tell you the dates, but I went ahead and put the dates. COVID-19 data was collected beginning in 2020. Cases that were coded as COVID-19 positive in the database were excluded from analysis from January 2020 through December 31, 2021. People ask me that question quite a bit, especially when they're looking at their data over time and they're like, well, was this patient excluded? So if you need those dates, it's in the IQVIA library. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there is a way for you to risk adjust your OE locally. And I have several slides here that were actually developed by Miss Judy Smith from Charlottesville, Virginia. She had a great presentation on this, and it kind of outlines the steps if you're interested in doing this. You, of course, need to know where the multiplier table is if you're interested in doing that, and it's in the STS database under for data managers, and you can see adult cardiac multiplier tables right above the harvest deadlines, and you can find your multipliers there. I'm not going to really go through these steps. These are for people who are interested in risk adjusting their OE locally using the multipliers. Judy has laid it out very nicely, step 1 through step 5. And I wanted to put this into the presentation because I think that it's helpful information for people who do this locally. All right, so I know that was a lot of information, and I want to thank you for listening. To remind you that next Tuesday at 12 Central Standard Time, we will have session 6. I think it's going to be a great session. Updating site forms, STS help desk, REDCap forms. That session is going to be led by Banu and Paul. So I think it's going to be really, really informative. So without further ado, we'll take questions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Melinda. That was amazing. We do have several questions. We tried to answer, Banu, myself, and Leanne tried to answer a few in the Q&A, but we do have several questions. Melinda, can you go back to the slide that has our schedule for the webinar?
Oh, right here?
Yeah. Yeah, we had, I've had via email and also on this webinar several comments about difficulty finding the topic of the webinars in the on the website. So if I'm working with marketing on trying to find a way to make it easier to find the topics if you want to review a one of the webinars. Also, the recordings or videos have a description at the bottom of each of those. But until we can get or find a solution, if you guys want to take a screenshot of this schedule, the webinar slides are labeled with the date and the session number. So if you want to get a screenshot of this schedule that has the topic, until we can figure out the best way to label those on the website, I wanted to give you the opportunity to do that. And then also some of the documents that we spoke about, or that Melinda spoke about today, the National Report Analyses Overview, that is on the IQVIA platform under Library, and I put a link to that in the chat. The Process and Outcomes Measures document is on the website. It's currently labeled in QF Endorsed Measures. That will be changing, but it is located under Data Collection Resources under Additional Resources. And that is also in the chat. I think that's all I need to mention about some of those things. Okay, so questions. Judy has a question about mortality. So are hospital mortalities also excluded from the morbidity measures in version 4.2 like they are for 2.9? Is it just not stated because there is no died in hospital option for version 4.2, or are they really included in 4.2 but not 2.9?
I'm not sure I understand her question.
I know.
I'm, I'm trying, Judy, I'm trying to understand your
Hey,
question.
yeah, I think Judy, what Judy meant to say is not hospital mortalities, but probably intraoperative mortalities. Um, in that option, I believe they are excluded from the morbidity, postoperative event morbidity measures because they can't, they would never meet the measure or never fall out of the measure since they died in the OR.
Hmm. Yeah.
Hmm.
If you look at these morbidity, if they expired in the OR, they're not included.
Yeah, I think that's what Judy meant, not in hospital mortalities.
Okay.
All right. Perfect. Blair is asking, are there any updates on when we can stop collecting the pre-op beta blocker information?
Not yet.
And Shuli, will there be any updates regarding the use of high-intensity statins?
I haven't heard anything about requiring high intensity statins, just a statin. Anybody else?
I have not.
I have not either.
All right, I think, okay, Mary, GTSD has moved away from star ratings. Are there plans for ACSD to remove the stars as well? Currently, there are no plans to remove the stars from the ACSD. Melinda, can you go back to the slide? Oh, here you are. You're there already. Quick today. We were probably already there. Anyway, we wanted to look at this slide again about domain 1. Then Mary has a question about confidence interval ranges. What is ideal, and would missing data affect the 95% confidence interval?
I don't, I don't, I don't think there's an ideal range. I think it's based on your
Yeah.
your patients that are included in the particular measure.
Yeah,
And th
I can expand on that a little bit,
thank you,
Melinda.
thank
Yeah.
you.
So the confidence interval uh, uh, is a good reflector of a reflection of the number of cases or your population size. The smaller the confidence interval, the more reliable the results are because you have a larger population. So a larger population is going to shrink your confidence interval because we're able to say with more certainty how your site is performing for a specific outcome. So smaller is better, but you don't really have control over that because it's the number of patients that are included in the population. The larger, I think Melinda probably already talked about this, the larger the confidence intervals, the wider the confidence intervals is sometimes how it's referred to, usually indicates the site had a smaller population for that specific outcome or before that specific population. And it's a little bit less reliable when well, it is less reliable. Um, they're making a good estimate using the risk models. The risk models are reliable. The results that occur and fall within, they're 95% certain that your result is going to fall where it's at. When you have larger confidence intervals, 95% certain that's where it's at, but you have a larger range to choose from for that 95% certainty. So smaller populations cause larger confidence intervals. The results are valid, but they're not as specific when compared to sites that have larger populations and smaller smaller confidence intervals. So hopefully that was a good summation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen, are the domains weighed equally for the overall star rating? I know that mortality is weighted highest, or higher. Medications are weighted lower. Do you have a slide about that,
Yeah.
Linda?
I don't have the weighting.
You don't?
It's in the national this is Carol. It's in the national report
Mm.
overview. Mortality is weighted the highest, and then morbidity. And for morbidity, it's one or any. So if you have prolonged event in one patient and you have prolonged event and new onset renal failure in another, those patients are weighted equally in the morbidity domain. So it's one or any, and that's just how the risk model is built. And then after that is the process measures, which includes the medication and for CABG, and then the IMA usage. And it's in the national report overview. You'll see when you look in the national report overview, the total percentages. So a percentage is given to mortality, a percentage is given to morbidity, and then a percentage is given to the process and outcomes measures, or the process measures, the IMA and the medications. You'll see that total percentage equals greater than 100. And that is not an error, it's accurate, and it's just the way the risk modeling is performed and the way it's built. So nothing's wrong with that calculation. It's like 102% or something. And that's how the risk modeling it was built.
Thanks, Carol.
Mhm.
You might have to help with this next
I
one
love
too.
this stuff, Nancy. You know that.
I know you do.
Yeah.
And for the person who asked, I can't tell your name, a webinar dedicated to the interpretation of scores would be helpful. Well, you're in luck for the last Data Manager Training webinar, because Carol, who loves to talk about reports and data, will be delivering a talk on just that.
Yeah, and if you have and if you have some specific examples you want me to walk through, feel free to email them to either Nancy, me, or Melinda, and I'll try to cover that as best as possible.
Yeah. So this question from Shuli, is the risk model risk adjusted or risk standardized?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to interpret the difference, and maybe it's just because I'm not educated enough on it, between risk adjusted or risk standardized. But the models are they risk adjust for the outcomes are risk adjusted. The output from the models the endpoints are risk adjusted. Risk standardized, I might need a little bit more information on Shuli to address that, exactly what you're thinking on that one.
All right. Thank you, Carol.
Yeah.
Amy, for O to E, does STS divide the observed by the denominator population and then divide by the predicted? O to E equals observed mean count over denominator population divided by mean risk values.
Yeah, I think I just responded to her. I think she may have just sent an email too. Hold on, somebody did, and I forwarded it. See if this was the one.
Yeah.
It was from Amy Morris. I just sent it over to have. I think we need to read that a little bit further, Amy, with what you're saying in the email. I just sent it over to Nancy and Melinda to look at and respond on the email, unless you feel comfortable doing that.
I need to.
Yeah.
I probably need to review and give an educated answer. So we will we'll answer your email, Amy. All right. If you were compiling the electronic risk adjusted dashboard report and any helpful guides to send to your surgeon group at a site, what would you include in your packet?
Well, I definitely include the process and outcome measures, the mortality, risk adjusted rates for that. And then I would really depend on what the surgeons really wanted to see. Some surgeons have particular things they want to see every month or every 2 months. So I would have a conversation with them and say, hey, this is what I'm planning on sending you, but what else would you like me to send you that you think is really important for you to monitor?
Will the COVID question be omitted in the next version?
I'm not sure that decision's been made, but I know
Yeah.
we've had some conversations on that. Is Carol still here? Does she know?
I'm always here, Melinda. Yeah, I agree. I don't know that we've made any final decisions. We haven't started the formal upgrade process yet, but it is on our list of things to ask for. So we'll see what the surgeons are thinking.
Are there any
Oh.
plans to expand longitudinal reports to include medications and IMA? I don't know of any current plans to include those.
Not
No,
that
I
I'm
mean, Sean, if you want to submit that to Banu, I think we could put Banu and Paul's email in the chat box. It's the STS database help desk. We can add that to a future discussion with STS and IQVIA because we do have some changes that will come to the longitudinal report. And if this in the next year or so, if this is something we can get added in and sites find it helpful, we can look at the possibility of doing that.
So Chris is asking about statins and valve surgery. What are the exclusions for not prescribing a statin at discharge for a valve case? I have a surgeon who feels if the patient has no history of CAD, then they should not have to prescribe the medication at discharge. What is the best direction for my team?
Well, Chris, there are no measures for valve surgeries for medications. So it, from a process measure standpoint, there's no recommendation that valve surgeries go home on a statin. The statin at discharge measure is only for isolated CAD patients. So my direction would be as if your patient should be evaluated whether they need one or not, and your provider should make that decision. There's no measure for that.
Judy says her question earlier, she actually did mean in hospital mortality.
Saw that. And so, sorry, Judy, in-hospital mortalities are not excluded from the morbidity endpoints. Only patients, the subset of those patients are patients that died in the operating room, and those patients are excluded.
And Lynette is asking about something in
Yeah.
regards to reoperations.
Well, the only thing I can think is because I get this question all the time, are reoperations excluded from mortality or any kind of measures? I get that questions a lot. No, they're not. They're not included. They're not excluded from measures just because they're a reop. They are not excluded from mortality. And reop does not affect case isolation. These are just the common questions I usually get, Lynette. I have no idea if that's what you mean or not, but that's all I can think of right now.
Can you explain in the star rating example why medications was 2-star and not 1-star?
Okay, so maybe here. Is this one she must be talking about? It's 2-star and not 1-star. So, oh, I see why. Because, okay, this patient, participant score is 94.81. The STS is 95.54. So you're lower than the STS. But if you look at your credible interval here, the STS score is included in your score. So you would be 2 stars.
Yeah, so I just received an email from Beth Keneally. She had questions on this too. I'm just gonna explain a little bit in addition to what Melinda said, just a little bit more detail. The 95% confidence interval is the range your site, we're 95% confidence that your score, when we do the risk adjusted analysis, we're 95% confident that your score is going to fall between this range. for this site, if we're looking at medications, we're going to say we're 95% confident that it's going to fall between 93.92 and 95.66. So we're going to give this site a score of 94.81. That's what the risk model is calculating. So that's your confidence interval. And then when we look at the STS score of 95.45, you have to see if that 95.45 falls within your 95.45 confidence interval. If it does fall within that, now remember we said that we're making an kind of an assessment or an assumption through risk model analysis. So it's not like a loosey-goosey kind of assumption. It's a statistical assumption that your score is 93.92 to 95.66. The STS score is 95.45. It falls within that range that we're making the statistical assumption on. So their site's going to be a two-star program for that. Now, if you look up above, you could see we're going to look at use of internal memory. This site was a 3-star program. Most sites are, but we'll just use this as an example. The site score was, we're saying it's 99.77. When we do a 95% confidence interval, we're saying we're making a statistical assumption that it's going to be somewhere between 99.55 and 99.91. So we're giving it a 99.77. The STS score is 99.54, which is just below the lower range of the confidence interval, which is the statistical assumption. We're saying the site's falling somewhere in between. So statistically, taking into consideration the site's lower range of the 95% confidence interval, the site's lowest range of that confidence interval is greater than the STS score, which is going to give the site a 3 stars for that internal memory. Now, the reverse is true, and the reverse is true in an example where the site's highest part, let's just pretend for a second that the STS score for the use of internal memory, let's just pretend that that STS score, instead of 99.54, we're going to pretend it's 99.94, okay? So we look at the site's score, 99.7, their confidence range is 99.55, was the low side, the high side, highest we think they analytically could be is the 99.91. If we take that STS score, the pretend score of 99.94, it's going to fall on the, even when we look at the highest score that this site could possibly be is the 99.91. That pretend score of 99.94, the STS score, is to the right or is higher than what the site's highest part of the confidence interval range is. So then that site would be a 1-star program. So you have to look at the STS score, you have to look at your confidence interval and determine on this screen, actually, I don't know if you have a screenshot of this, Melinda, or not, but on this screen on IQVIA, if you scroll down, and I'm happy to share my screen and pull it up real quick.
What is it? What are you looking for?
It's the range. It's like the bar graphs.
No, I don't think I have one of those.
Okay, let me pull it up real fast. On the bar graphs, you can read it a little bit
I can
different.
stop sharing.
Okay, let me just pull up a site here. I'm going to go ahead and share real fast. And I think we're going to talk more about this when I do my presentation. Maybe it's not next one, but the following one. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't
That's
know.
right.
I'm just doing it when you guys tell me I'm supposed to do it. So in the, we're going to go to the risk adjusted report and then the quality ratings, which is going to be the star ratings tab, quality composite ratings. On the screen, you'll see what Melinda had on her screenshot. And then if you scroll down, there's a bar graph. So I'm just going to go to quality ratings for cabbage. We have to wait for the number to pop up. On the bar graph, you'll see it's kind of a nice representation because you'll be able to see your site's 95% confidence interval kind of highlighted in blue. You see then what your site's score is, and you see what the STS's score is. And then it's a little bit easier to tell if your site score is to the left on that. So this site all had 3 stars and a 2-star for internal memory. This is what I was talking about, this graph here. So the light blue is the STS. This is the STS min max range. So everything higher, or the highest scores and the lowest scores. For absence of morbidity, we'll just look at this one for the site. The site's 95% confidence interval is graphically represented here with this darker blue line. The site score, we're making a statistical assumption that this is the site score, 94.57. And then the red dotted line is the STS's score. So in this case, the site's lower end, or I'm sorry, higher end of their confidence interval, if I can pull it up, hold on. Maybe I clicked too many things. Let's see if it does it. Oh, it's not doing it. But the upper end of the site's, the lower end of the site's confidence interval is higher than what the STS's score is. So the STS score is lower than what the lowest possible score that the site could receive. The STS score is lower than that. So the site's performing better, statistically performing better than the STS. If you look here at this one, this is the internal memory one. The STS score is within the confidence interval of the site's, the STS score falls within the 95% confidence interval at the site. So this is going to be a 2-star program. We don't have any 1-star programs here, but, or 1-star results. But this is an example. If we look at the absence of mortality, you have the site's 95% confidence interval. The STS score is right on the cusp of that, but the site's still performing better than the STS, even at the lowest possible that the site could be performing through analysis, through statistics. Even at the lowest possible, the site is still performing better than STS. So that's a 3-star program. Now, if this red line was on the other side of the site's confidence interval, it would mean that you could read that the opposite way then, that the site, even the highest possible that the site could perform, you're looking at the analytics, the highest possible is still not as good as STS, and that would make them performing worse than expected. Okay. That's all I got.
Well, Carol, can I ask you something? So
Yeah.
I think there's some of the language, like in the analysis overview, it talks about credible intervals, but then on the reports, it talks about confidence intervals. Are we using those terms pretty much interchangeably, correct?
We are, yeah, they're interchangeable for these reports, confidence interval and credible intervals.
Okay. That's what I thought. We have several questions about that.
Yeah.
That's why I was asking.
Yeah, they're interchangeable. I think we use confidence intervals when we do the manuscripts and things like that. Credible intervals, I'd have to Google to see what the difference is, if there even is. But for these reports, we use them interchangeably.
While we have you, Carol, can you talk about how volume plays into the star ratings?
Yeah, so sure, I sure can. So the way you'll see this is your confidence interval, and I don't know how many sites or how many patients this site has, but let's see if I can pull it up. This site had a pretty good number, so 1,378 patients that fell into this analysis for absence of mortality. That's a pretty good number. It means that their confidence intervals, the more data we have, the more likely we're able to predict how the site is performing. So it's similar to thinking about the less data you have on something, the less predictable that event is happening, right? So if you only experience something 1 time or 2 times, the 3rd time might be a little questionable, right? It could go either way. You're not quite sure how it's going to go. But if something happens 100 times, and the 100 times it always happens the same way, or you're able to better predict how that 101st time is going to happen. So kind of think of it, kind of think in confidence intervals in the same way. The more procedures, the more occurrences that something occurs, the more procedures we have to analyze for a site, the better predictor it is on your outcomes. So that means your confidence intervals are going to shrink because we become more and more, it's 95%, but we become more and more confident in the site. So the confidence interval shrinks, even though it's the 95, it still says 95%. That means we're 95% sure that you're going to fall within a certain range. The more procedures you have, that range shrinks. The less procedures you have, the less confidence we can say, or the less predictable that site's performance is going to be. So that confidence interval becomes wider. It means that you only had 2 procedures. We can only give you, we can only give you what we know of those 2 procedures. And that's going to make our confidence even a little bit, or predictability in that site's performance less than the higher performing site, higher volume sites. That help?
Yes.
And I can show you, I don't know if we have it yet, the, let's see if we could do it on the multi-valve. Multi-valve is one where not a lot of sites have perform multi-valve procedures or perform a high volume of multi-valve procedures. And this is the reason why we will not report multi-valve procedures out in a star rating, because the volume is low, that the whole STS is confidence, the whole STS, only a few sites have enough procedures to give us small confidence intervals to say that we're predicting that the probability of events happening it falls within a certain range. So you'll see the confidence intervals pretty wide. So the observed to expected for operative mortality is for this site, we're going to look at it's 0.16 to 8.18 for 2022. Still pretty wide in 23 and for 24. My guess then from looking at this is this site probably has a lower volume, because when we get to the light group and we get to the region, we can see that the light group, look at their confidence interval, it's 0.60 to 1.63. So as the volume increases, and remember, this is the whole entire light group for that, wherever that participant is, this is the whole entire light group that that participant is a part of. It's not 1 or 2 hospitals, it's that whole group. So they have a much larger N, and that confidence interval shrinks with that. So it becomes a better predictor of the site's performance. And the same thing with the region, it's all the sites within that region. And you can see that the confidence interval even gets smaller there. So that's a good example. These for my dogs are upstairs howling. For this report, for this report on the multi-valve procedure, it's important to remember that the wider confidence intervals, even though we can risk adjust and provide you results back on them, with wider confidence intervals, it gives you a large range of where your site could possibly fall. When you get into smaller or larger populations, the smaller confidence intervals, it gives us a better predictor of the site's probability of performing at that level. Did that help?
I thought it was helpful.
Okay.
All right. We have a couple of people with hands raised. We'll try to get to these real quick. We're about 6 minutes over. Allison, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. What about Jenny? Jenny, or
Yeah,
hey,
could you put up the quality rating slide again? I have just a quick question about that. The quality rating detail slide.
Oh, yeah, I can pull it back up. Hold on 1 sec.
Okay.
I didn't know if you wanted my slide or Carol's.
Oh, that's fine.
It doesn't matter. Just the one that, shows you your mortalities, and I just have a quick question. And I hope I don't make it confusing.
Are you talking about that one?
No, the one like after your star rating slide.
Oh, okay. Maybe. No. This one?
No, the one that like you have your cabbage, all your domains and your star rating, and then the next slide, shows you all your quality rating details.
Carol, do you know which one she's talking about?
I
This
do.
one?
Hold on.
Okay, I'm gonna stop
No,
sharing because I'm like,
I'm
I'm not
happy.
sure. I'm not sure which one she's talking about.
I think I got it. Hold on. Hold on.
You just had it up, yeah.
It has to reload. Sorry.
I hope it's a good question now that I made you go through all this. Maybe I can just ask my question. Okay, in the morbidities, if there's, I think I understand the concept, but if somebody has in the prolonged vent category, if you only had prolonged vent, you would be counted there. But say
Oh,
in
yeah.
that,
Yep.
in the multiple morbidities category, okay, see where it says multiple morbidities?
Mm-hmm.
So in there, if say one of those patients had prolonged vent, renal failure, and a stroke, it would only be counted there. It would not be double counted, correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
That's correct. And it can get a little confusing when you're trying. You have to know which, and we'll go over this when I present a little bit more in detail, but you have to know which reports to look at when you're looking for quality improvement projects versus your analytic, like your outcomes for your risk adjusted outcomes. So the reason it is reported out this way on this report is because one morbidity counts the
Mhm.
same as multiple morbidities in the risk adjustment. The weighting for the risk adjustment,
Okay.
morbidity part of the risk adjustment. So it'll say cardiovascular accident only. It'll have 6 patients. These patients only had a CVA.
Mhm.
But there could be other CVA patients within this multiple morbidity
Right.
tab that had
Okay.
something else happen, like prolonged vent or renal failure. That's right.
Okay. Okay, so you're gonna show later on what else to look at for like process improvement. Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, I can pull it up real quick. I just didn't want to, under the
No,
bench.
I can wait. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
It's under benchmarked and isolated cabbages, and then post-operative events is where you'll find this individual detail for
Okay.
each a specific
Okay.
bad outcome. Yeah.
All right. Very good. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
All right. I don't know if Allison still wanted to ask a question, but if you do, Allison, you can unmute yourself. Kim has posted in the Q&A the weightings for the star ratings for each domain, if anyone wants to look at that. Judy also posted a link to the 2018 risk model manuscript, if anybody wants to view that. And then we have a couple of comments about star ratings. My site doesn't show a star rating.
If your site's
Yeah.
not showing a star rating, it's usually because you did not meet the inclusion criteria to be included in the composite rating. The inclusion criteria are listed on the executive, that's listed in the national report overview, but also on this community page or executive summary.
Yeah, we talked.
Oh, you did it already? Okay.
Well, no, we talked about that last week in our last webinar, all about that. But go ahead, Carol, please.
That's all right. It's here. It's listed here under current
Yeah.
harvest missing unknown composite rating. The criteria is listed here, and it's also in the national report overview.
The last webinar isn't on the website just yet, but it should be within the next couple business days if you missed that one. We just sent it to marketing today.
Oh, thanks, Emily.
Yep. All right, and then just one more comment about multi-valve. The case total numbers are over the total number of cases. I'm not sure I understand that comment.
I don't think I understand that. I don't think I understand it either, Nancy.
Yeah, okay. If you want to send an email directly to me, Nancy, I'll try and figure out
Maybe a
for this
screenshot,
question.
a
Yeah,
screenshot of what you're talking about.
yeah. Yep. All right. Um, if there are no more questions, I guess we can wrap this up for today. Thanks everyone for joining. We really appreciate it. Our next training webinar will be April the 1st. That's next week. That will be Banu and Paul. And then on April 8th, Carol will talk more about reports and star ratings. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. And we'll try and get these posted to the website so that you can re-review all of this wonderful information that Melinda has provided.
Job, Melinda, Nancy, Carol.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
All right.
All right,
Thanks,
thanks.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Good job.
Thanks, all.
Thanks. Bye.